Hello and welcome everyone to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Thank you so much for tuning in, guys. Hope you all had a wonderful, relaxing weekend, but we are back to talk some fantasy sports this week with some all-new content. Today should be a great show. Today we're going to be talking about IDP leagues. They make their triumphant return in terms of rankings. We're also going to talk about the Eastern Conference representative in our Stanley Cup Finals, the Florida Panthers, their path to the finals, their fantasy success this season, and we're also going to talk a little bit more about fantasy college football. I know you guys kind of been tuning into that, so we're going to be talking about our breakout players for next season, who I think are the next stars of the fantasy college football season next year. But before we get into all that, I do ask that you always like, follow, and subscribe to the show. We do get a lot of tips, donations, comments, concerns, questions. So please, if you have any of those, leave them at the link gsmc.cloud. It helps the network a lot. It helps me, my fellow podcasters. So do please consider doing that. So without further ado, let us get right into the show, starting off with the IDP rankings making their triumphant return. We transition from the stars of the IDP leagues to the rookies, the next stars, the next faces of these defenses. And we start off with the D-line, one of the deepest D-line classes we have had in recent memory. There should be some very enthralling players on this list. I think that there's a wide variation of different teams, different conferences, so it should be a very exciting rankings. As always, I am going to pull up my graphic right here and get right into it, starting off at number 10, someone who I think has one of the better situations in this rankings with Jonah Elliss out of Utah. Let's just talk about his last season as a collegiate athlete. He was a Pac-12 honorable mention over at Utah. 26 tackles, solo tackles, 6 tackles for loss, and 3 sacks. And he goes to a Denver Broncos team that really has more mid-level linebackers. Right now, he's currently sitting at a second stringer. He's behind guys such as Alex Singleton and Cody Barton, who are kind of developing themselves as well. So it should be really intriguing to see if Jonah Elliss can step into the rotation because of the fact that he's sitting behind 2 guys that haven't fully developed yet. So I'm really looking for Jonah Elliss to be kind of one of those breakout stars for the Denver Broncos defense. Obviously, a defense that went from last year being one of the statistically worst defenses of the league. Obviously, they had that devastatingly poor performance against the Miami Dolphins, if anyone remembers that. And then in the latter half of the season, we saw some major improvements from them. So look for Jonah Elliss to be fully integrated into this Denver Broncos squad as a nice rotational piece for your IDP team. Coming in at the number 9 spot, another kind of interesting prospect. He came out of Western Michigan, not necessarily a school known for producing these kind of players. Marshawn Kneeland, he goes to a Dallas defense that is rife with talent, so we'll have to see how he steps into that rotation. But speaking of his stats, in his career at WMU, he had 149 tackles, 12 and a half sacks. He had a pretty good combine as well, 4.75 40, 35.5-inch vertical. So I'm looking for Marshawn Kneeland to not step into a D-line in Dallas that is already there, one of the better defensive lines in the league. You have guys like DeMarcus Lawrence, and obviously the do-it-all linebacker behind him in Micah Parsons. But I think this is a fantastic pick, the 56th overall, good value for him at this position. And I think he's going to be one of those prospects that, while not starting right away, you do expect him to come along. Dallas is very good at developing these young D-line prospects, so I'm really excited to see not what he does this year, but perhaps next year and in the next 5 years as he's integrated into their D-line rotation. Coming in at number 8, another very exciting player in Chris Braswell of Alabama last year. He moves to a Tampa Bay defense who, in my opinion, is going to quickly move up the fantasy rankings in your traditional dynasty league or PPR league, whatever league you play. But Chris Braswell is an excellent addition for your IDP team. I think he's someone who's going to be in the rotation right away. Obviously, the Bucks have so much talent at every level of their defense. But this is a guy who has fantastic combine, 4.6 40, 33.5-inch vertical. And last year at Alabama, he had 11 tackles for loss, 2.5 sacks, and a forced fumble last year. So look for Chris Braswell to move into a Bucks defense that is more known for the back end and their defensive front, but is going to grow and develop drastically. They lose Shaquille Barrett, so they need new faces to step up. I think you have guys like Yaya Diaby and Joe Tryon Shoyinka who are going to become the next faces, but in about 3 or so years, give Chris Braswell time to learn from these younger talents and grow as well. So I'm really intrigued to see how Chris Braswell develops in a defense that will be developing along with him. So this is a very exciting ranking for Chris. Coming in at the number 7 position, a guy who I feel like is heavily underestimated right now in terms of this rookie D-line class. He had a fantastic combine, tested very well, Braden Fisk, but I think it's the fact that he's on an LA Rams defense that is trying to find their new Aaron Donald, and they already have 2 guys in front of him and someone else on this list coming up next who I feel will be more involved in this defense. However, I don't think that Braden Fisk will really suffer from it early on in his career. I think he will get the chance because he did test very well at the combine. 4.7 840, 33.5-inch vertical. So you can see the talent, the traits are there. I think he had a fantastic year at Florida State last year, partnered with the guy coming up in these rankings and who will be one of his running mates in this young LA Rams defensive front. But ultimately, right now, Kobe Turner and Byron Young, they already have that 1 year in the league where they stepped into a defense that is looking to evolve post Aaron Donald. So we'll have to see if Braden Fisk is part of those plans. Right now, I do see him as kind of more a second string type of player right now. But ultimately, I'm really excited to see how him and his new teammate who is joining him from Florida State and is later in this rankings. I just gave you a very big hint as to who that is. But overall, this LA defense, look out for them and look out for Braden Fisk's name to come up a lot in the very near future. Coming up at the number 6 level, we have a very exciting young player out of Penn State, the 21st overall pick in the draft, going to the Miami Dolphins, who also added a lot of depth up front and is returning some injured depth to that position group. The Chop Robinson man. 4.4 840 in the combine, 34.5-inch vertical. Last year, his last collegiate year at Penn State University, he had 26 tackles, 5.5 sacks. So you can see the fact that this is a very nice developmental, high ceiling kind of athlete that Miami gets, but he will have a lot of competition in this Miami D front. You have a guy coming in Shaq Barrett who has already proved he can produce in Tampa. You are bringing back Bradley Chubb and Jalen Phillips from injuries, and you have a guy in Jalen Ramsey in your back end who is a star in this league. So Chop Robinson will be looking to try to find his way in this Miami defense. I don't think he will be integrated immediately like some of these players, but look for him to be a nice player maybe a couple years down the road, and this is a very decent ranking for him at the moment. So yes, coming in at number 5 overall, another Robinson out of Missouri, going to an Arizona team where I definitely think he will play because they are not as deep as some of the other teams on this list defensively. Darius Robinson at the combine, he had a very good combine, number 27 overall pick. 4.4 540, 35-inch vert last year at Mizzou, 35 tackles, 3.5 sacks. So you can see Darius Robinson. I think this is a very astute pick from a Cardinals defense that is trying to add more depth. They are one of the worst teams in the league and it is seen in their defense. They have some players who they're trying to build around, but not necessarily in the D-line. They have guys like Budda Baker and Sean Murphy-Bunting, but obviously those are two D-backs. They need depth up front, and Darius Robinson is sure to add that. He's currently probably their best D-lineman right now. They have some kind of mid-level pieces that they're trying to piece together to try and salvage a defense they're trying to create. But overall, Darius Robinson immediately becomes one of the better Arizona Cardinals defensive players. And I think that he will be a very wise pick if you're looking for a steal in an IDP league. Coming in at number 4, one of my favorite defensive players in the class, mainly because he's one of the only D tackles on this list, and mainly because he will really rejuvenate my favorite team's defense right behind me. Go Hawks. Byron Murphy II over there at Texas, another one of my favorite teams. Interestingly enough, the second defensive player picked in this draft, he is a fantastic player. Obviously, the stats do not reflect it because of the fact he is in the interior, but his measurables at the combine are pretty extraordinary for a guy of his size and his abilities. 4'8", 40, 33-inch vertical, not too shabby for him. Last year, with his partnership with Devondre Sweat, he was the Big 12 D lineman of the year there. I really am intrigued to see how Mike McDonald uses him. Obviously, Seattle is known for picking these high-end defensive players in the draft, but never have they drafted someone as high as Byron Murphy. So I'm really intrigued to see how the first defensive pick post-Carroll will develop with a defensive-minded coach who really wants to add him to this kind of new base defense for Seattle. At the 16th position in the draft, I think he's a really high-value pick. He's not necessarily going to get you that sack production, but look for him to get some TFLs in the run game because he is immense in that department. I think he could prove to be another steal like Darius Robinson before him for a Seattle defense that obviously wants to get better, but is still in that phase where they really have to find out what they have in Mike McDonald. Coming at the number 3 position, the player picked before Byron Murphy. At number 15, the first defensive player off the board in Laiatu Latu. I really like Laiatu Latu, but there are concerns about his health. Obviously, he had to medically retire when he was still at Washington due to a neck injury. He transfers to UCLA, plays again, becomes one of the best defensive players in college football. And I really like that the Indianapolis Colts took a flyer on this kid. I really love what he did at UCLA. Last year, he had 15 sacks. At the combine, he had 4'6", 440, 32-inch vertical. I really love Laiatu Latu as a player. If he's healthy, I think that he will step right into an Indianapolis Colts defense that is eager to get better. They have some players we've talked about on the show in the linebacking core, and Zaire Franklin, EJ Speed becoming new faces. And he's going to learn from guys like DeForest Buckner up front. So I'm really excited and enthralled to see how Laiatu Latu, a player who, when healthy, really has that high-end production coming through with the Indianapolis Colts. I really think this was a huge pick for the Colts and could be a huge pick for you guys in an IDP league. Coming in at number 2, the guy who is going to partner with Braden Fisk, a fellow Florida State alum. Jared Verse moving as well as Braden Fisk to the LA Rams, becoming another one of those guys who they're looking at to become the next quote-unquote Aaron Donald. I really don't think that Aaron Donald can be replaced, but they're definitely going to try, and Jared Verse is one of those players who will be tasked with doing that. At Florida State last year, he had 18 solo tackles, 17 TFLs, and 9 sacks in his senior year. 4'5", 40, 35-inch vert at the combine. One of the freak athletes in that Florida State D front last year. Incredible player. 19th overall to LA. In all reality, I really don't think that the LA Rams will truly replace a player of Aaron Donald's caliber, but Jared Verse is definitely a very interesting high-end value pick in this draft. I think that at Florida State, he was the face of that defense. He was the leader and heartbeat of that defense, and he will be tasked with doing that. for the LA Rams in a very transitional phase for them. They already have certain players who they've looked at before, but Jared Verse comes in to kind of make that transition easier for them. But he's not number one in these rankings, and I really like who this number one player is, and that is Dallas Turner. What a bad man he is, moving to a Minnesota team that is losing a lot of production up front. I really think this is a huge value pick. Could be a fantastic steal for Minnesota if he develops right. Last year for Alabama, he was an SEC Defensive Player of the Year. At the Combine, tested really well. 4.46 40, 40.5-inch vertical. So you can see the untapped potential that a player like Dallas Turner has, and he moves into one of the best situations on this list. In a Minnesota Vikings team that lost a lot of production up front, like I said, they lose guys like DJ Wonnum, they lose Dalvin Tomlinson. So Dallas Turner has a chance to become one of the better players on this Minnesota defensive front. He's going to learn from a guy in Jonathan Greenard, who they brought in from the Houston Texans, who is another player who is quickly becoming one of the better defensive ends in this league. So it should be very intriguing to see how Dallas Turner is integrated into that Minnesota Vikings system. But that should just about do it for this segment of the show. I was really excited to look at this D-line class, one of the deepest in this class for rookies. But coming up next on the show, we are going to look at the NHL, where I'm going to be talking about the Florida Panthers and what it took for them to get to the Stanley Cup Finals, both in this series and kind of as a whole and during the season. And also I'm going to be looking at some fantasy breakout players for them that help them along their journey. So it should be a very, very, very interesting segment. We will be right back to talk about that.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world?
Hello and welcome back, everyone, to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. Before we get into the second segment of the show, where we'll be transitioning from football to hockey, I do ask and want to remind you again to please leave a tip or donation. Let me get rid of that graphic here at the link gsmc.cloud. It is greatly appreciated. Huge support to the network, so do please consider that. Getting into today's second segment, like I said, transitioning from football to hockey, where we have to give our due respect to the Eastern Conference representative of the Stanley Cup Final, the Florida Panthers, obviously winning the Eastern Conference Finals in 6 games over the New York Rangers. We've talked a lot about this Florida Panthers team, and we talked a lot about how they have come together as a collective unit, wanting to get back to the Stanley Cup Finals like they did last year, but want to win it this time around. So congratulations to the Florida Panthers. We will have a proper Stanley Cup Finals preview tomorrow. I know this series is set. We will give the Edmonton Oilers their due respect as well out of the Western Conference. But let's focus on the Florida Panthers and how they got to this point, returning to the Stanley Cup Finals. This Florida Panthers team is one of those teams where you really cannot find a weakness within them. They just have fantastic players that may not be stars of the league. They may not be guys who will be facing definitely in McDavid and Draisaitl, but they are well-rounded and balanced players who come together as a team, as a collective, to reach their one true goal, and that is winning the Stanley Cup. Obviously beating a New York Rangers team that had that same desire, had been to the conference finals as well before. So congratulations to the Florida Panthers yet again. I cannot sing their praises enough. But I just want to highlight 3 breakout players in terms of fantasy and for the season that the Florida Panthers have that are going to be very integral to them finally breaking through and winning their first title in their history. Starting off with a player who I seem to have kind of transformed into this huge fantasy player. I predicted that he would have a breakout series against the New York Rangers, and he didn't prove me wrong. Sam Reinhart, a fantastic overall player, strong in almost every facet of hockey. He is such a fantastic player to watch, and this season he could do no wrong in terms of fantasy and on the ice. 340.15 fantasy points this season. 6 fantasy points per game. So as you can see, like I said, he's not going to be one of the stars in terms of fantasy. Obviously, he's not even one of the bigger stars in the league. But Sam Reinhart is one of those players who you can't help but love, especially when you're looking for a guy, whether it be in your daily fantasy hockey team or just your fantasy hockey team proper, that will just deliver for you in every occasion and every big moment. We had some huge moments in this series on the power play in terms of defensively. He had a lot of hits. He's so strong in the face-off. So kudos to Sam Reinhart for being one of those fantasy players you can always rely on. But moving on to another Sam, and Sam Bennett, who has just come on strong these past couple of games. I think he's going to have a huge Stanley Cup final. Had a great fantasy season as well, along with Sam Reinhart. He had only 154 fantasy points this season, but he averaged 7.7 fantasy points a game. Yet another one of those guys you can just rely on off the bench as a utility option this fantasy season. And when it comes Stanley Cup final time, we'll be tasked with trying to combat an Edmonton Oilers team who is so potent offensively and on the power play in every facet of their game. Look for Sam Bennett to be one of those guys to step up for a big occasion. And coming in last, a guy who also is not necessarily a big point production, much less points than the 2 guys I mentioned before, but he is an integral part of the Panthers' defense that has been so good this postseason, and that is Brandon Montour. Only 129.5 fantasy points this season, but he is one of those guys in the Panthers' defense who is so reliant. He's a top-level line kind of guy. So look for him to be the focal point of the Panthers' defensive mindset in the series against the Edmonton Oilers. But I just want to talk about the Florida Panthers as a whole. This is a team that obviously has had so much heartbreak throughout the years of their franchise. Never, ever won a Stanley Cup final. Obviously, they made it last year when no one was really expecting them to. They were not heavy favorites against the President's Trophy winning Bruins, one of the best teams statistically in NHL history, and they went out there and played their butts off and swept the Bruins last year. So just seeing how far that this team has come with the way they've grown their players, the way they developed their players, the interesting trades they've made along the way. Sam Bennett, a guy who they acquired from the Calgary Flames a couple of years ago, immediately integrated into this team. They just never say die. And even though my rooting interest lays for the Edmonton Oilers in this series, I'm a huge Oilers fan, and want to see McDavid and Draisaitl win as much as anything, I still can't help but appreciate the fact that the Florida Panthers are doing this without any true star. Obviously, you have guys like Alexander Barkov and Matthew Tkachuk, you can say, are the stars of the Florida Panthers, but they don't really have that one guy or a superstar on their team you can point to and say, hey, this guy is the cream of the crop. And that is why I so truly love the fact that they are in the Stanley Cup final. I wish them the best, but obviously, as an Oilers fan, I'm rooting for my Oilers all the way. We'll talk about that tomorrow. But congratulations to the Florida Panthers, man. They just get the job done consistently, series after series this postseason. And they are truly one of the better teams in the Eastern Conference, who I'm really hoping will continue to go to Stanley Cup Finals in the near future. I really love how they developed this team. I cannot express that enough. Look for the 3 players I mentioned to have huge series. Obviously, if you're still playing daily fantasy hockey in the Stanley Cup Final, look out for those 3 guys. But I kind of want to talk about the Rangers as well. Obviously, fantastic series. Cannot get over the hump yet again. You kind of feel for them. But in big moments, their big-time players did not step up, and that is the difference. You know what I mean? I think that you have guys like Chris Kreider, who's a Rangers legend, but still cannot get over the hump. Mika Zibanejad had a pretty decent series, but ultimately not enough high-level production. And then you have a guy in Artemi Panarin, who I was kind of imploring to get going, talking about some fantasy players for the Rangers a couple episodes ago. But it does not mean that they did not have a fantastic series. They just ran into a juggernaut in the Florida Panthers, who just had a proven identity. And right now, the Rangers are starting to get that identity, but I just don't think they're quite ready yet. They still are stuck in this mindset where they want to integrate these young guys like Lafreniere and Capo Caco, who had fantastic postseasons last year, and guys like Will Cooley and Matt Rempe. How do you use them to move forward? But they still have guys in Chris Kreider and Mika Zibanejad and, like I said, Panarin, who have stuck around for this entire journey, who they want to cross the finish line with. And right now, I just don't think the Rangers can say at this point that they've completely figured it out. I think it's up to Peter Laviolette, their coach, to kind of make that choice. Where do we want to sacrifice a couple of these higher level players to maybe bring in some younger talent to help develop this next generation of New York Rangers? Or do we kind of stay put and hope that this current crop of veteran players has it in them to reach that level? It just did not happen for them this season. I think that it could have. I think that they had the talent to get there, but they ultimately fell short because the Florida Panthers have that identity already, and the Rangers just could not match it. But, like always, that is just about going to do it. Congratulations to the Florida Panthers. I promise, we will give the Edmonton Oilers their due respect, because as an Oilers fan, I can't just let them fall by the wayside tomorrow. But that will just about do it for this segment. Coming up next, we move back to football, where I will be looking at my fantasy college football, which makes its return to the show. Breakout players who I think will be the next faces of fantasy college football leagues. Should be a great segment. We will be right back to talk about that.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube.
Hello and welcome back, everyone, to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. I hope you enjoyed that last segment. I enjoyed it, but moving back into the football realm, specifically fantasy college football, I know you guys have been liking those segments, so I said, why not bring it back to the show? But this time we are not necessarily talking about rankings in that perspective. We are talking about breakout players, guys who I really think are going to be the next big thing on the fantasy college football stage and in college football as well. I have 5 players who I really like for this upcoming season who could be huge steals for you in your fantasy college football leagues. So that without further ado, let's get right into it. I'm really happy about this segment. So, starting off with kind of a local guy by me, a guy who I've actually seen live and seen what he can do, Kyle Monangai out of Rutgers. like I said before, I had the opportunity to see Kyle Monangai live and in person when his Don Bosco Ironmen faced my St. Peter's Prep Marauders in the state final in my senior year of high school. But what I really liked about Kyle Monangai and what I saw from him in that game when he was still a developmental kind of player, not the player we know him today, was the fact that he had this huge ability to have yards after contact. He had fantastic burst of speed, change of pace, change of direction. So I really think that a lot of people may not know about him if they're not into New Jersey kind of football. But at Rutgers, he is a huge player, and here's why. Last year, he had 242 carries for 1,262 yards and 8 touchdowns. He was the first player to average that for Rutgers since Jawan Jameson did it in 2012, over 1,000 yards. And this is a kind of Rutgers team that really needs to rely upon the run game, because over the past couple of years, they haven't really had their stability at the QB position. Obviously, Athan Kaliakmanis of Minnesota transfers in, so they really hope that he will be able to produce at a high level at the QB position. But this, by no means, is a QB-centric team. This is definitely a running-oriented team, a very physical team in the trenches, and Kyle Monangai is a huge part of that. So I'm really intrigued to see if he can develop, maybe become one of the premier running backs in the country right now. He wasn't on my fantasy college football top 10 list. He wasn't on the radar of some people and pundits who really try and find these nice little hidden gems for you guys. But ultimately, he is going to be a fantastic asset should you decide to pick him up in your fantasy college football draft. Coming in at the second position right now, Connor Wegman of the Texas A&M Aggies. Now, speaking of teams that really haven't had that stability at the QB position, but at a team with a higher profile than that of Rutgers, Texas A&M really is trying to find its next big thing at QB. Not since Johnny Manziel could I have said that Texas A&M has had that kind of stability at the QB position. But in Connor Wegman, they will trust for this season. Last year, he kind of stole the starting job away from Max Johnson in his sophomore year and going into his junior year. He's really exciting. He kind of stepped into the starting role in Week 9 a couple years ago. He had 979 yards, 8 touchdowns, 2 interceptions last year. So you can definitely see the high-end talent that he brings to the table for A&M. As they try and find that QB, they fired Jimbo Fisher. Maybe his kind of culture and style did not work out for other QBs such as Canes King, Zach Calzada. But we'll have to see how Mike Elko develops a guy in Connor Wegman, who I'm really excited to see try and develop his potential. So Connor Wegman, look for him on fantasy college football draft boards. But coming in third is another young receiver from LSU who kind of moves into that number 1 QB role for Garrett Nussmeier this upcoming season in Kyron Lacey. Obviously, LSU loses its top producers on the wide receiving end of things in Brian Thomas and Malik Neighbors. So Kyron Lacey will step into that number 1 role. Obviously, they also lose Jaden Daniels as well, so they're looking to have a new security blanket for their new QB, Garrett Nussmeier. And last year, Kyron Lacey proved kind of at the number 3 spot that he has the potential to be a number 1 receiver in college football. 30 catches last year for 558 yards and 7 touchdowns. So I'm really intrigued to see how Garrett Nussmeier is able to develop in this new look LSU offense. I think that they definitely have the potential to be a surprise team in the SEC, and Kyron Lacey will be a huge part of that. Another receiver who I'm really looking to step up because this team definitely needs to help their QB, Bo Collins. Last year, you saw with Clemson, we've talked about them a lot on the show, that Cade Klubnik definitely needs that number 1 kind of guy. We've talked about his tight end, Jake Briningstool, who had some of the most yards on this team, but they really need that high-end wide receiver to help them in ACC that quickly is adding new teams that will try to challenge the cream of the crop in that duopoly of Clemson and Florida State. And Bo Collins, I think, will be that. You can see that he has the potential like a guy in Kyron Lacey. who is stepping into a number one role. 38 catches last year, 510 yards, and 3 touchdowns. Bo Collins, overall, I think it's out of necessity that I'm picking him here. He just needs to be the guy for Cade Klubnik to rely upon in this kind of transitional period for the Clemson Tigers, and ultimately I think he can do it. So look for him on fantasy college football boards as kind of that sneaky, under-the-radar guy who you would be kind of rewarding yourself if he pays off in the future. And coming in last, our only tight end in this list. I think this is one of the better tight end rooms in the country, and they certainly have a quarterback who definitely relies on them. In Mitchell Evans, obviously, as a tight end, he's not going to be one of your biggest producer on your fantasy college football team. But he definitely has the high-end upside to do it. Obviously, Notre Dame brings in Riley Leonard of Duke after kind of a shaky period for them at quarterbacks, where they saw guys like Tyler Buckner and Drew Pine kind of fail. So I'm really intrigued to see how a tight end group that is projected to be one of the better ones in college football with Reardon and Evans. I'm really excited to see how that all plays out there. But that will just about do it for this segment of today's show. I really love talking fantasy college football and can't wait for the college football season where we can get into more things like betting odds and who I think will win certain awards in the college football season. It should be really exciting once the season begins, but for as of right now, I'm really thrilled that I'm able to present to you guys some fantasy college football rankings and different players. This was a truly exciting segment for me. But coming up next, we move back to IDP rankings. We'll be looking at the rookie linebacker crop. These are highly developmental guys, so be wary of that, but I'm really excited to present them to you. Coming up next on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts.
Hello and welcome back, everyone, to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. And for our second to last segment of today's show, we transition back to IDP ranking, specifically the rookie linebacker class. Now, this is a position group in this class of rookies that I think is one of the weaker ones. Some of these guys on this list you might not necessarily want to pick up. These are very developmental, raw prospects, but I'm really intrigued to see how they all play out. I think most of them are in very good positions to maybe become starters in their respective teams, but overall, I do want you guys to be aware that these are mainly developmental guys who I don't think will get nice rotational time in the NFL this season, but in the very near future, they could be the next faces of the league. So coming in at the number 10 spot, we have a guy who kind of stays in his home state, a player from Temple, Jordan McGee of the Washington Commanders, their 5th round pick. Had a very nice career at Temple, where he's 3rd in TFLs last year in the AAC. He was 2nd team All AAC last year. He had 31 tackles for loss, 8.5 sacks last year, so he is a very nice little mid-level prospect, mid-round prospect for Washington. And I think this is one of the better situations that he could have gone into as a mid-round prospect. I think that he's going to be learning from one of the great leaders at the linebacker position in Bobby Wagner, who they brought in. Washington is one of those defenses where you can't really say they're one of the best. They are looking to transition. Not only do they have Bobby Wagner, but they have another young guy in Jamin Davis, who is becoming one of the better on-ball linebackers in the league. So Jordan McGee, I think, is a very nice little mid-round prospect for Washington. As for IDP, I think that you should be wary about picking a guy who might not start right away, but he is in a very good situation, like I said. Coming in at the number 9 position, we have a guy in Tyron Hopper with the Green Bay Packers who I really think people should be looking out for, mainly due to the fact they have a guy at the linebacker position who they might not be a huge fan of. But Tyron Hopper, who was their 91st overall pick, I think that he is going to be one of those guys who has definitely the potential to start right away due to the thinness of the linebacker core in Green Bay. He had a 4.68 40, 36-inch vertical. So I really think that he has the high-end traits needed to take over the Packers kind of linebacker position. He's going to be learning under a guy in Quay Walker who kind of has had his ups and downs in his NFL career. Obviously, he had a couple of behavioral issues. But Tyron Hopper is going to be one of those guys who I'm really excited to see develop and grow in this league, in this Packers defense that's also one of the more underrated ones in the league. So look for him to potentially, in a couple years' time, be a nice little pick in your IDP league. Coming in at number 8, a player who I'm really excited about for Seattle as one of their mid-round prospects under the new regime in Mike Macdonald and John Schneider. Tyrese Knight out of UTEP, their 4th round pick. Last year at UTEP, he had 140 tackles, 15.5 tackles for loss, and 4.5 sacks, 7 passes defended. So, as we've seen with Seattle in the past, they really have had that ability to draft these mid-round defensive prospects and develop them. And I think that in the new Mike Macdonald era, they really want one of those kind of guys, because right now the question marks in that Seattle defense are definitely at the linebacker position. Obviously, they lose Bobby Wagner, a guy who they were kind of hoping would transition this younger version of a quote-unquote Legion of Boom for them. And now their top choice linebackers are Jerome Baker and Tyrell Dodson, who are above average at best. So look for Tyrese Knight to potentially get a lot of playing time this season, but further down the line, I think he's going to become one of the faces of the Mike Macdonald new look defense. Coming in at number 7, Jeremiah Trotter Jr. He goes to a Philadelphia Eagles team rather, who I really think are looking for some more developmental pieces to kind of sit behind the core they're building. Last year at Clemson, where he's one of the better defensive players in college football, he had 13.5 tackles for loss, 6.5 sacks, 2 interceptions. So you can see that Jeremiah Trotter is one of those mid-round prospects who Dallas were happy to take a flyer on. Obviously, he's learning behind Micah Parsons, so should something happen to Micah Parsons and they need kind of an emergency type of guy, Jeremiah Trotter Jr. fits that profile. I'm thinking about Dallas defense. I'm sorry, guys. Kind of got mixed up there. They're still in the NFC East. But Jeremiah Trotter is one of those guys in this Philly defense who wants to build their core, rather, around their guys who they already have. And Jeremiah Trotter will just fit into that rotation as they go along. Coming in number 6, this is the Dallas guy, Marist Liufau out of Notre Dame, who is a guy, obviously, who was learning behind Micah Parsons, not Jeremiah Trotter Jr. Sorry about my mistake. He had 44 tackles last year at Notre Dame, 4.64 in the combine in the 40, 30-inch vertical. So, Dallas, this is one of the players, like I was saying about Jeremiah Trotter Jr. when I confused teams, that Dallas is happy to take a flyer on. They obviously are all set at the linebacker position. But Marist Liufau is definitely one of those developmental guys who could, because he's learning under such a high-profile player, be one of those guys who learns quickly and gets some nice little playing time. Coming in at the number 5 position, out of UNC, going to a Tennessee Titans defense who really is looking to build upon what they have there, Cedric Gray. At UNC last season, he had 121 solo tackles, 5 sacks, 2 forced fumbles, and 1 INT. He had a nice little combine performance at 4.64 in the 40 and a 35.5-inch vertical. So Cedric Gray moves into a defense where they're kind of a mid-tier defense. They have their guys. They have guys like Aziz Al-Shaair, Harold Landry III. And they're looking to build on their little core that they're trying to create over there in Tennessee. And Cedric Gray could be one of those players who see some time. There are guys in front of him who obviously are looking to be the new faces of this Tennessee Titans defense that lost a lot of production. But look for Cedric Gray maybe in about 3 to 5 years to be a guy who I would rank kind of in the top 50 linebackers for Tennessee, a team that definitely is looking to improve on the defensive front. But coming in at number 4 is a guy out of Kentucky in Trevin Wallace, who definitely is going to have a lot of playing time in a Carolina defense that right now is just trying to stay afloat. They obviously signed guys like DJ Wonham and Jadeveon Clowney in hopes of bolstering that defensive front, but in a Carolina Panthers team who still projects to be the worst team in the NFL, they really need new juice and depth along their defensive front seven, and Trevin Wallace could provide that. I think out of Kentucky, he had a nice little combine, 4.51 40, 37.5-inch vertical. Last year at Kentucky, he had 54 tackles, 2.5 sacks, and 1 interception. So look for him to be one of those players who gets the most playing time out of this group because of the fact that he's on the Carolina Panthers. But getting into the top 3, these are truly guys who I think will be starters right away, if not very high-level players in their rookie seasons. They weren't picked very high in the draft, but these are guys who I truly expect to be the faces of their teams come 5 years or so. Starting off with truly fantastic pick for this the Pittsburgh Steelers, a steal in their draft class, Peyton Wilson out of NC State, a 4.4 340 in the combine, 34.5-inch vertical. Last year at NC State, 80 tackles, 5.5 sacks. Truly incredible player and prospect who I'm glad that the Pittsburgh Steelers got. Obviously, he's not the fastest, he's not the strongest linebacker, but Peyton Wilson is one of those guys who was willing to develop. He had a truly remarkable career at NC State, and in a Pittsburgh Steelers defense that is looking to become one of the better defenses in their storied history, look for Peyton Wilson. While he might not reach the levels of, say, a Jack Ham or Joey Porter, 2 legends in terms of Pittsburgh Steelers linebackers, look for him to be one of the guys that Mike Tomlin, should he stay as the Pittsburgh Steelers coach for a couple more years, is willing to entrust the linebacker position with. Coming in at number 2, Edgerrin Cooper out of Texas A&M, also moving to the Green Bay Packers. So they could be building something strong at the linebacker position with him and Hopper. His final season at the Texas A&M Aggies, he had 3 tackles for loss, 3 sacks at the combine, 4.5 140, 34.5-inch vertical. I'm really enthralled to see how Edgerrin Cooper develops in Green Bay along with Tyron Hopper. Also learning under Quay Walker, may want to surmount him as one of the premier linebackers for Green Bay. So I'm really, really thrilled that Edgerrin Cooper is on this list. But coming in at the number 1 position is Junior Colson out of Michigan, going to an LA Chargers team where he truly could potentially be one of the better players because of the fact he's learning under a Chargers defense that is rife with talent and a coach in Jim Harbaugh who really wants to push his philosophy on this Chargers team. Last year, he was second team All Big Ten. 95 tackles, led the team at a title-winning Michigan squad. I think that Junior Colson, while he's on a team in the Chargers that is looking to create a culture that post-Brandon Staley transforms into one of the better defenses because of the pieces they already have. I think Junior Colson, because of the fact he's learning under stars like Khalil Mack, Joey Bosa, Asante Samuel even, I think this guy is going to develop rather quickly. And while, as always with this kind of list, these are developmental prospects, Junior Colson is one of the most promising because of that factor. I think that in an IDP league, he could be a very intriguing option in the later rounds of your IDP drafts, but I'm really excited to see what he can do. That'll just about do it for this 4th segment of today's show. Coming up in our last segment, it is never too early to do your fantasy basketball seasons for fantasy basketball rankings for an upcoming season, and this should be a very, very interesting list. So stick around for the final segment of today's show. Hello and welcome back to today's last segment of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, and it should be a good one. It is never too early, like I said before the break, to rank your fantasy basketball players for the upcoming season. We obviously have a fantastic, enthralling finals ahead of us, but looking ahead to the 24-25 season, it's never too early to do. And I'm really excited to present this list to you guys. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. Coming in at number 10 is one of those players who I still think is really underestimated in today's league for his talents both offensively and defensively. One of the more well-rounded big men in this league, in Domantas Sabonis. And I'm really not shocked to see him on this list. Some of you might be, but Domantas Sabonis has been one of the premier big men in this league for quite some time, kind of like a baby Jokic in my opinion, because of the fact he's so efficient in every area. One of the top assist leaders for big men in this league. Looking at his stats from last season, 19.4 points per game, 13.7 rebounds per game. And if you're looking for someone who averages a ton of minutes, he is perfect for that for you. 35 minutes and 42 seconds average time on the floor. But for a Sacramento Kings team that is looking to be one of the better offensive teams in the league, we saw it 2 years ago. Obviously, this year kind of regressed to the mean, but Domantas Sabonis is one of the stars of the league. He deserves to be on this list, no matter what people might think. And I'm really excited to see him develop with this young Sacramento Kings team that's looking to be one of the better teams in the Western Conference. I think he could be a fantastic fantasy player for you next year. Coming in at number 9, we have a player that a lot of people are familiar with, and when healthy, also is one of the best centers in the league, Anthony Davis. An incredible season last year for him. 41 points average, 20 rebounds, 5 assists, and 4 blocks in 41 minutes. AD, I think, is one of those fantasy players who a lot of people are kind of like skeptical of due to the fact that he's never truly had a fully healthy season in the league for the Lakers. But the Lakers as a team are one of those teams that are looking to transition. They still haven't found a new head coach. There are a lot of question marks around them. But should they choose a coach that wants to develop a guy like Anthony Davis, then they will be enthralled to have him. He is a huge piece for them. And when he's healthy, this was obviously one of his better seasons because of the fact that he remained healthy for a long while. Look for him to be one of those guys who you're thinking, should I draft? And I think that ultimately you should, and you won't regret it should he remain healthy because of the fact that the Lakers are a team in transition, and he will be expected to be the face of that team. Coming in at number 8, a breakout fantasy player this year, and a player who is going to be one of the better players in the league for years to come because of his efficiency and production. Tyrese Halliburton for the Indiana Pacers, such a well-rounded player. If you're looking for a player who plays at a premium position, is efficient, gets all his stats in all the right places, Tyrese Halliburton is your guy. 20 points last year, 11 assists, a steal. He is such an incredibly well-rounded player for someone so young, and for an Indiana Pacers team that's up and coming, look for him to be a huge point getter. Obviously, in the playoffs this year, you kind of saw him kind of get a little tired and labored. Can't always produce for the Indiana Pacers because of the fact that they really trust him as their star. But overall, he is one of those guys who is going to be a very efficient player. The Indiana Pacers offense often runs through him, so he's going to see a lot of production. So that is why I think this is a well-deserved ranking for Tyrese Halliburton. Coming in at number 7, one of the most scrutinized, criticized fantasy basketball players and basketball players in real time, in Jason Tatum. I think that Jason Tatum is proving a lot of critics and pundits wrong, both in real life and in fantasy. This has been one of his better fantasy seasons in the postseason as well, but also in the regular season. He's good for 26.9 points this year, 8.1 rebounds, 4.9 assists, and he still plays a high number of minutes. But when it comes down to the details, man, you can't rule out Jason Tatum ever in this league. He is a star of this league. He plays for a Boston Celtics team that is so well-rounded. He's so unselfish as a player. Some people think that hurts him a little because of the fact they want him to be the guy, to be the face of the Celtics, but in fact, it actually really helps him fantasy-wise, the fact that he has this team that he relies upon so much to carry him over the line. Look for him to be one of the better fantasy players next year due to the fact that he is one of those guys who wants to be more efficient than be a star. And so, Jason Tatum being on this list does not surprise me in the slightest. Coming in at number 6, Giannis Antetokounmpo, probably one of the better fantasy players over the past 5 years. He kind of is one of those guys who, has been up and down a little bit, had his injuries, but overall he still is one of the best players in the league. 30.4 points this year, 11.5 rebounds, 6.5 assists, 1.1 blocks. So overall, Giannis Antetokounmpo being here is no surprise. He's an efficient, productive player for the Milwaukee Bucks. They definitely want to keep him around for as long as possible. Obviously, he was up for the Supermax a couple years ago. But this is a Milwaukee Bucks team that really their championship window is closing. Maybe there's talks of Giannis moving out of Milwaukee in the future, but for now he's going to be one of their biggest stars, and due to the fact that they always are able to find nice role players for him, I don't think his production is in any jeopardy of going down. Coming in at number 5, actually the number 1 overall fantasy player for this season, we'll talk about that a little bit on the next episode, Joel Embiid, who proves that when he plays and is healthy, he is an MVP caliber star of this league. 34.7 points average this year, 1.7 blocks on the defensive end, 1.2 steals. One of the preeminent centers, dominant centers in this game, no matter how you slice it. People often complain about him. He's a dirty player. He's always complaining about fouls. But he has the stats to back it up. And I think that him being the number 1 overall fantasy player should prove to you guys that he is worth taking. And Joel Embiid is a guy that ultimately can challenge the center-driven league, and guys like Jokic and Sabonis, and a guy who's number 1 overall on this list. Hint, hint. I just think that Joel Embiid being here makes a lot of sense. So look for him to be a high pick in your upcoming fantasy basketball drafts next year. Coming in number 4, probably the best player in the world right now, and a guy who has a huge chance to be number 1 come the end of the 25 season and even this season, Luka Doncic. What more can we say about him? He is a star. 33.9 points, 9.2 assists. 9.8 rebounds. So Luka, you should never be concerned about a player like Luka in fantasy. He is a first ballot player on your team, first name on the team sheet in fantasy basketball if you get him, because he definitely will be at a premium. So Luka Doncic obviously has such great role players that he can rely upon. He's part of a duo with Kyrie Irving where he doesn't necessarily have to worry about doing everything by himself. The fact that the Dallas Mavericks are more team-centric right now should make him more scary. Look for his points to skyrocket. I think he could average close to 40 points next year. I know that's a little bit outlandish for a guy who is not necessarily a center or a big man, but magic happens when Luka Doncic plays basketball, and so I'm really excited to see what he does next year. Coming in at number 3, a guy who's truly skyrocketed to be one of the premier players, point guards in this league, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. A young up-and-coming talent for a Thunder team that surprised a lot of people as the number 1 seed in the West this year. I think he's just going to be so efficient. He has such a young core that's really, really fantastic and intriguing. So look for him to be the face of the Oklahoma City Thunder for years to come. 30.1 points last year, 5.5 rebounds as a point guard, 6.2 assists. So you can see the efficiency. You can see the levels that he's at right now, even though he's still very, very young, and this Thunder team is very young. Look for him to continue to develop. The sky's the limit for a guy like SGA, and I would entrust him as one of the number 1 point guards in fantasy next season. Coming in at number 2, this guy is no surprise for being this high. Probably one of the best players in the league. Right now, I see him at number 2 because Luka may surmount him should he get his championship next year. But for now, Nikola Jokic is a guy who can be said to be one of the best players, if not the best player in the league. Quickly becoming one of the best centers of all time. You never have to worry about Jokic. I remember a couple of years ago, perhaps my sophomore year of high school, I was in a fantasy basketball league with my friends, and I was telling them, hey guys, I really want to draft Nikola Jokic at number 1, and they were all looking at me crazy, like, what are you thinking, Chris? You're wasting your number 1 pick on a player who can get a little bit later in the draft. And I'm saying, no, I truly think this guy is one of the best players in the league. He's going to be one of the best centers of all time, and I'm proving to be right. My prediction a couple years down the line looks to be a stellar one. Nikola Jokic, man, I'm just going to go over his stats, and you guys just try and draft him next year. 26.4 points per game, 12.4 rebounds, 11.4 assists at the center position. Such a pleasure to watch. Such an incredible athlete. Just always willing to adapt to the game. That's one thing I truly appreciate about a guy in Nikola Jokic. So, Nikola Jokic, man, I think he deserves to be number 2 on this list, if not number 1. Because number 1 is really kind of a surprise to me. I can see it because of the fact he's a young player, number 1 overall pick, last year, this year actually. I just think that Nikola Jokic, I'm really surprised he's snubbed. Even Luka Doncic can be a case for number 1. But at number 1, without further ado, is a player who can be number 1. He just needs to continue to grow his game and progress in his team. Victor Wembanyama. I think that right now I wouldn't put Victor Wembanyama anywhere close to the top 10. I still think that on a Spurs team where you don't have players who are very talented, I think it's too much pressure for Victor Wembanyama to be expected to be kind of a number 1 player for a fantasy basketball team. But I can see maybe in a couple years, like 5 years or so, Victor Wembanyama could be a very nice fantasy player, and we're already seeing kind of the foreshadowing of that coming in his stats. I think he has 21.4 points per game this year, 10.6 rebounds, 3.9 assists. You can see that should Victor Wembanyama get the talent around and the core around him to be even more efficient, he could very well be a player who I would have no hesitation putting in a top 10 fantasy player list. But right now it seems a little bit too high. You have guys like Jokic, Luka, Tatum behind him, Giannis even, Embiid, who I think are just better at this point. But Victor Wembanyama at number 1, in 5 years' time, I would not be surprised. But right now, I kind of am. But that should just about do it for this segment of today's show. And that concludes today's show. I love talking to you guys about all these different topics, looking at IDP coming back. You have the Panthers, what an incredible season to them. Congratulations to them. And obviously the fantasy basketball is always exciting to talk about. So thank you guys so much for watching this episode of GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. As always, I do ask that you like, follow, and subscribe to the show. It is a huge support to the network. So it is highly appreciated. Leave a tip or donation at the link gsmc.cloud should you wish to. But thank you guys so much for tuning in. My name is Chris Shepard. We should have another exciting episode tomorrow where we're talking a lot more about the Stanley Cup Finals, the NBA Finals. We have a lot to discuss. But thank you guys for tuning in to today's episode. I will see you guys tomorrow where we'll be back and better than ever.